It's really my pleasure now to welcome our speaker, but who is going to introduce our speaker is another very special person who is no stranger to the Renaissance Society. He has presented to us many times before and is just a wonderful friend of our organization. Uh, excuse me, James Scott of the Sacramento Public Library. So James, if you would come and introduce our speaker, we'd be delighted. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Thank you very much, Deborah. And go Renaissance Society. It's so great to be back here, and thanks so much for the invitation and welcome to this Renaissance Society talk. My name is James Scott, and I'm the archivist for the Sacramento Public Library. And certainly blessed are the content creators, because they're the ones that affect history. They're the ones that keep history alive. And today's speaker, Bill George, is that sort of person.
Oh, I kicked it up.
Yeah. So, like a few of us, Bill is not from California. He was raised in Chicago and eventually went off to study journalism at the prestigious J School at the University of Missouri in Columbia. Go Mizzou. He spent 42 years as a journalist and marketing and public relations executive. He came to Sacramento as a reporter for KCRA. And also, like a few of us who aren't from California, Bill came to the Golden State and he stayed. Bill founded Nimbus Films in 2011, producing films on the Transcontinental Railroad from Sacramento to Donner Summit, the Chinese experience in California from 1849 to 1875, the rise of California agriculture, and his very recent film homage to Rancho Cordova. Today's talk on Sherm Chavoor and the swimming prowess of Debbie Meyer, Jeff Float, and others has been distilled into this fantastic book, Victory in the Pool, published in 2023 by Roman and Littlefield. One thing I want to mention, and this is off the notes, is that Bill is a terrific communicator. He is a mainstay within the Sacramento cultural heritage community, and he's also about building relationships. And I can say back in the spring, we had Bill in to talk about his book. And not only did he bring himself, but he brought Debbie Meyer and Jeff Float, and they brought their Olympic medals. Good. And it was just a magic moment. And that doesn't happen without Bill's ability to connect with people on a very, very human level. So simply put, Bill is a massive player in our region's effort to, again, keep the history alive. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bill George.
Thank you, James. And I should say, James has been in one of my films. He's a great resource. Whenever I have a question, I call over there and, James, can you find this out? And he does. So thanks again. And thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. This is the second time I've spoken to the Renaissance Society. The first time was about my first film from back 10 years ago or so, about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, one of the seminal accomplishments in the history of Sacramento. Do you like to read, find quotes? Anybody here quote collectors? You know, you see something and you keep it. Yeah, I love to do that. So I'm rereading Shelby's Foote's The Civil War, which is an amazing 2-volume history. And probably a lot of you are nodding, you know. I have a Shelby Foote imitation I'll do after the show. But I read a great quote, and the Union was, the war broke out, and the North was outraged at what the South had done, and they are mad. And it was a great quote, and this guy was raising a battalion, and the reporter said, well, are you ready to fight them? And he said, yeah, we're going to fight them till hell freezes over. And then we're going to fight them on the ice. That's that. Now, there's the way to take a cliche and turn it around. So today's quote. So I'm ready. So you want to go up one more, I think. Okay. So this is kind of a little tongue-in-cheeky thing. Sacramento's greatest story, the shocking true story. You know, you have to have all these great superlatives. It's called Victory in the Pool. I wanted to call it Their Times in the Pool, because my book really is about more than swimming. It's about the era of the swimmers in their lives and also in Sacramento. And I take a very wide look at this and follow them through 3 Olympiads, one of which I covered, and 1968. So how many folks were here, say, in 1960? A lot of you. So, you know, the town has just about doubled in size since then. So a lot of people don't know about the Arden Hills swimmers or about Sherm Chavoor. How many of you knew about Chavoor? Anybody? Oh my God. I could have a tough time here. That's great, because I find a lot of people and a lot of prominent people don't know who he is because they weren't here then. Oops. Yeah. So the reviews are in, and here's some of them. You can't read them. You can see them afterwards. But I point this out because I have Beth Ruiak and Christine Hansen here. In here, both of whom I worked with. You might remember them. Beth has covered numerous Olympiads. And of course, Christine was one of the first sports reporters on television here in Sacramento, probably some of the first sports reporter of it in any medium here. And again, covered a number of them, and they loved the book. And I like to point that out. And they're good friends of mine. The beginning. So I start my book actually talking about post-World War II California. And I like this scene, kind of idyllic. This may have been what, you know, a swimming pool looked like in those days. Not a big deal, an apron, a couple of chairs, nothing like the aqua complexes that we have these days. But it did happen, start in California, and one of the key things was gunite, which was a cheap way of taking concrete and spraying and making pools. And so soon gunite pools were up and down California, and kids were swimming in their backyards. Age group swimming came about. And this is really not well known. Even in swimming circles, a lot of the swimmers have never heard this story. So there's this woman from Marin County. Her name was Beth Kaufman, and she'd been a Red Cross instructor since the 1930s. When polio broke out, you know, many children were struck with polio. And how did they rehabilitate them? How did they get their muscles working again? Well, it was in swimming pools. So she opened up this program, and kids started to come from all over Northern California. And so she developed, and then, you know, kids being kids, as they healed and got stronger, they started to race each other. So she, along with another guy from the AAU, decided we need to have a venue for the swimmers, and they called it age group swimming. And this was a genius thing. The genius thing about it was it morphed into what they called the Junior Olympics. So you just weren't a 14-year-old age group champion or an 8-year-old age group champion. You were a junior Olympic champion. And that was a big deal. And this grew to be the biggest youth recreational program in American history, except for Little League. That's how powerful it was. And it still is today. And it was because of her work, her tireless work. It's in the book. Read about it. It's a great story. So she takes on the AAU with Karl Bauer. Karl Bauer was a German immigrant. He lived in the Midwest, and they hated the way that the AAU, which is very autocratic, top-down, ran the competition for the Olympics and everything else. So they totally changed it. And within a few years, and America had not been a huge swimming power up until that point. We had some great swimmers like Johnny Weissmuller, but actually some of the other countries, including Japan, were superior in the Olympics. In 1956, Sylvia Ruska of Berkeley, California, won silver and bronze in that Olympics. And then in 1964, that's when the U.S. really broke through with Don Scholander, Donna D. Verona, and some of the names. I see you nodding. I'm glad when people recognize those names. Doesn't make me feel so old. And they started the dominance there of the Olympic gold medal run, which lasted for a good 20 years. Who was Sherm Chavoor? Now there he is sitting on the wing of what I think is one of those trainers. And lots of questions about Sherm. I thought this would be a good story when I got into it, just because of the achievements, but I had no idea. So I like this quote. If you can read that. It's from a new introduction of the Odyssey. Tell me about a complicated man. Tell me how he wandered and was lost when he wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered in the storms at sea, and how he worked. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. Tell it from the beginning. And that's what I tried to do. So here's some ones. You might read these real quick. These are some of the questions that I came up with as I developed them in doing the research. Was Sherm Chavoor his real name? No cheating now. How did you know that it wasn't his real name? Okay, you read it somewhere. Really? Yes. Well, most people had no idea that his real name was not Sherm Chavoor. His real name was Ezekiel Correa. He was born in Hawaii, and he came here. He always said, and with Sherm, you kind of had to, take everything with a grain of salt as to what he was saying. But he said that his father was a sugarcane worker, and that when he was a young boy, I think he was less than 1 year old, they came on a steamer over to the Bay Area, and his father worked in the docks there. Why did he change his name? No one really knows, including his daughters. No one knows. Was he an Army, Air Force war hero? We look into that. Was he a UCLA football star? Was he the swimming coach who couldn't swim? So as you read about Sherm Chavoor, when you read these stories from back in the day, the stories would usually start out with the Arden Hills swim team, run by a swimming coach who doesn't know how to swim, swept the whatever meet it was. I mean, over and over. So no, Sherm could swim. Was he an Olympic caliber swimmer? No. But did he know enough to teach it? Sure, he'd actually taught it in the Army. But he knew PR like no one. And I'd been in this business, like they said, 40 some years. This guy was a public relations genius. And I don't use that term lightly. He knew how to work stories like no one I've ever seen. And we'll talk about some of that. Did he have a PhD in psychology? I can't find it. Was the only millionaire swim coach? Yeah, absolutely, he was. And he built his own world. It didn't come from coaching. It came from developing Arden Hills. Was he a coach of Olympic swimmers who won 20 gold medals? Hell yeah, he was. And I like this. He had a way of communicating with people. And again, I'm of a certain age where a lot of my coaches were World War II guys, right? Vets. And they had a great way of talking. I thought, how did you develop this kind of mockery / praising? So it would go like this. Hey, George, what are you doing? You want to get off your butt and show what you can do? You're going to lay in the sun all day, or you're going to work? And that was Chavoor to a T. He would ride these kids all the time. Very few compliments. Debbie Meyer won a gold medal. Way to go, kid. It would be about the most she would get. So I found this movie. It's called Battleground. And there it is, that banter that they had. Hey, Jones, you want to take the hill? You want to open the machine guns up the next time before we run up the hill? I mean, and that's how they communicate with each other. That's how tough those guys were back in that era. His unlikely first great swimmers. So Chavoor comes out of the Army, comes to Sacramento, and gets a job at the Y. Did he petition to be the swimming coach? No, they just said, hey, we need somebody to coach swimming. And that's how he ended up there. He was a teacher, and he wanted to make some money. And that's how simply that's the story started. His first ones were kids from the Sacramento Y. Now, I hope you can see this picture. You'll see kids of different ethnicities, especially Japanese American kids. They had come out of the camps. They were looking for things to do. This is 1946. And so they went to the Y. And a lot of kids went to the Y in those days. There weren't a lot of clubs. And there was Chavoor with a whistle in his mouth, ready to teach them. Winners all, I love this picture. 1949, Aseri, Maegawa, Wimberley, and Johnson. There's one white kid in the pool. There's a black kid and two Japanese Americans, 1949. Chavoor took them all around the area, took them to Los Angeles, not just for swimming, but for a basketball tournament. And if they ever went into a restaurant or someplace where his kids weren't allowed to go in because of racism, he marched them right out of there. Tak Aseri, this is a great story. This kid grew up in Sac, and he was in the camps. He came out, and Chavoor befriended him at the Y, as he did everybody. And he quickly became one of Chavoor's first great swimmers. This is called A Sports Vignette by Murray Olderman, who was working in Sacramento at the time, later went on to fame at the New York Times as an illustrator and author, and told Tak's story when he was like 14. Was he a 1952 Olympian? Well, he was in the running for it. All these great stories in the papers about Tak Aseri, what a great swimmer he was. And he ended up going to Cal. He was a Pacific Coast champion and became the captain at UC Berkeley. He didn't go to the Olympics. Instead, he met this gal on the bus going back and forth from Berkeley one vacation. He married her, and they had a wonderful family. He's still alive. He was at the event James talked about at the library with Debbie Meyer. It was the first time that Debbie and Jeff Float and the other swimmers had really heard about him. He kind of lost touch with the program, but it's his accomplishments that really laid the foundation for the championships that came later and gave Chavoor his start in coaching. And I want to say, who's your PR guy? Because he got PR and I can't remember what this year, in the 80s or something, 1980s. And they did this whole article about him being a master swimmer, never mentioned he'd been a great swimmer as a youth for Chavoor and for Cal. So Chavoor works at the Y, and he is ambitious, of course, and he needs a better facility. So he goes to a couple other venues, and one is the Elks Club, and one is what is today called Park Terrace down in Land Park. Well, in both cases, it doesn't work out. He says that the Elks told him they wouldn't let minority swimmers in, and that's why he left there. And when he left the Land Park, I think he just had a run-in with the management. He wanted to run the whole thing. He didn't want to be just a swim coach. But I point out here, so he builds Arden Hills, and he leaves the Y, and he hires Ricky and Brooks. Now, I don't think he's got a lot of money at this time. I know he doesn't. You know, he's a swim coach and a teacher. But he goes out and he hires the best architectural firm in Sacramento. They built many famous buildings here. And instead of that, just a concrete shell we saw in the first slide, he builds kind of a palace, certainly one for the time, with a clubhouse, swimming pools. He just has a vision. And there's really nothing much like that in the area, certainly in the 50s. And he picks the site out in Arden Hills in Carmichael at the time, right? It's still Carmichael, and builds Arden Hills there. And it's enormously successful, not just athletically, but financially. Training at Arden Hills. So here's some of the swimmers. And he had what called over distancing. And in the book, you'll see time and time again, Debbie Meyer shows up at Arden Hills. Chavoor looks at her and says, get in the water, show me what you can do. Mike Burton does it. Mark Spitz does it. All of them. Of course, none of them, because his swimmers, by the time all those guys showed up, because of the 50s, they were already great swimmers. They were swimming 10,000 yards a day. Other kids were swimming a couple hundred. And they all had the same reaction. I can't do this. And it's a real family affair at Arden Hills. And these are some of the names, just some of the names, really, and these are all accomplished swimming families. The Baker family, the Ferris family, 3 swimmers there, 2 girls and a boy, all involved in the Olympics. Faveros, who ended up owning it, the Johnsons. Spitz, Mark Spitz's sister, Nancy, was a world-class swimmer. Not many people know that. The Fairbanks, Milos, et cetera, et cetera. So this whole thing developed right here in Sacramento. All people from Sacramento. Unlike a lot of swimming clubs, including Santa Clara, which was their main rival. They recruited from all over. Don Scholander was from Portland, and they recruited him to come down and swim there. That didn't happen here. Sherm didn't bring him in. Sue who? I always like this one. This is Sue Peterson, and hardly anybody remembers her name. And as an age 12-year-old, you can see the headlines. 12-year-old Susan beats the best. She was a first name basis. She was like LeBron back in the day, right? She didn't need to be Sue Peterson. Everybody knew who she was, and she was a world-class swimmer at that age, and she beat the boys. She beat everybody. She was a big gal. I love the name Pokey Watson for a swimmer. Hi, I'm Pokey Watson. But she was one of the great swimmers from Santa Clara. The AAU Junior Olympic meets were a big deal. There's a picture from probably the late 50s, early 60s. You can see the crowds they drew. And again, Chavoor being a PR genius, they were constantly in the newspaper, on radio. If there was a prominent swimmer on the other team, he set up interviews for them so the press would have another angle, and the great swimming coach who couldn't swim would have a great meeting. 1964, on the cusp of greatness. So this is Mike Burton on the right, and Mike is one of the great swimmers in Sacramento and in Olympic history, one of the great, probably the greatest long-distance swimmer of his era, would end up winning 4 gold medals in 2 Olympics. And that is, I forget her name, Joan Ferris. So there were, Joan and Carolyn Ferris were 2 swimmers. So here they are. They both made the Olympic, tried out in the Olympic trials in New York and Astoria Pool, and neither one of them made it, but it was the first time that they'd really, Arden Hills had broken through on the national level. There were many established clubs. Santa Clara was one, LA, another one, Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Boat Club had great swimmers. So there was an established hierarchy, if you will, at the time, and they were really nobodies from Arden Hills until they broke through. The best rivalry going. So that's what Sherm said. Debbie Meyer showed up, and Sue Peterson, who was a year younger, was setting world records really by that time. Debbie had not really been much of a swimmer, but with her attitude and her determination, she and Sue developed a big rivalry. And so Sherm said, hey, this is great. I got these 2 paired off against each other. And under Mike Burton's tutelage, really, and Mike was the guy, though I'll tell you, his work ethic surpassed anything anybody ever seen. And they just tried to stay up with him in the pool. And that's how they got great. Mexico City, 1968. I like to show this photo because it's the dominant image from that Olympics. And in my book, I talk about, and I always try to do the backstories on this Olympics and also on Munich 4 years later in 72, both of which Arden Hills played a big role in it. But there's a symbol, and it was, you know, the Black Power thing. And that was certainly appropriate, I think, but it obscured so much of what happened in those Olympics, but also what it meant to Mexico. And fortunately, I have a brother-in-law who's lived in Mexico, worked in Mexico, and knew that whole story and turned me onto that so I could research that. So Mexico City was a huge departure for the Olympics. The ones before that had been in Tokyo in 64, and you know, it was successful, but it was just kind of run-of-the-mill, if you will, in terms of. So Mexico City was the first time they had a cultural Olympics. The art, the design, the fashion, all these things were breakthroughs. The way the graphic arts were done, even for things like the signage at bus and train stations, it was all op art, and it really, as you can see, was a change. A fraught arrival, I call it. Here's Debbie, smile on her face. So she shows up in Mexico City. And, you know, we think we're in a political era now. We are. But you remember 1968 was the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia. That almost canceled the games. There was a kind of a worldwide movement among minority athletes to boycott the games. That almost canceled the games. And there were riots in the streets, not only in America. So the games were in October this year, which is late. Usually they're earlier than, like they'll be this year, they'll be in July and September in France. But they're later this year. I can't remember the reason. But all this was going on in the summer, very tumultuous. And a lot of people thought, well, just, you know, the hell with it, cancel the Olympics. Debbie Meyer was watching the news one night about 2 weeks before the Olympics. And, you know, Walter Cronkite came on and said, well, the Olympics could be canceled. You know, she started crying. She thought, oh my God. all the work I've done, it's not going to go. So she and Sherm, very interesting. And it was a love-hate relationship, truly was. And she could put up with him, as could Mike Burton, like most other people can't. They just had thick skins. And he would ride her mercilessly. When they were, by the time they got to Mexico City in 68, now she's 16 years old, okay? They show up and they've got a week down there before they compete. Well, all the other nations, all the coaches are coming by to watch them work out. Well, Chavoor is all over. Get going, Debbie. What's wrong with you? Are you trying to get a suntan? Move, move, move. They are shocked. They can't believe that he's treating her like that. And there's one point where she just broke down. And she said, she went to the hotel and she started crying. She ran into Donna Di Verona, and Donna Di Verona was 4 years older, more mature, and steadied her. And she said, think about what Sherm's going through, not just what you are, but think about how uptight he is. This is all of his dreams, everything. So you got to get it together. And she did. So 68, it's hard to reimagine how spectacular it was, but she wins 3 gold medals in individual races, first time ever been done in the history of Olympics. And it was such huge news. Now you have to remember, it's not like today where you got the internet or people on their cell phone back there like that lady. But just kidding. Just an example. But you know, it was not the same communications environment. It was also, though, the first Olympiad that was on live television in real time. So I remember I was 14 then, and I was just transfixed by it. I mean, it was just magical. And what she did on that stage under that pressure is truly, truly amazing. And Arden Hills shine. Now, Sherm is not just coaching Debbie and Mike Burton and 7 other Olympians from Arden Hills. He's also the coach of the U.S. women's team. And so he's got a lot on his plate. But Arden Hills comes through. Mike Burton won the 1500 and 400 meter gold medals. Sue Peterson won 2 gold and 2 silver. And of course, is forgotten today for some reason. I don't know why. John Ferris had 2 bronze medals. And Mark Spitz, and we'll talk about him as we go on, won 2 relay golds and a silver and a bronze medal. Arden Hills beats the world. These are amazing statistics. You can read them there. 13 gold medals. It beat Australia by 8 medals. The rest of the one, you know, it's just incredible what they did. So Spitz, he comes in as the top swimmer in the world. He's 18 years old. And I'll explain his story. I have to go back a little bit. He goes to Arden Hills in 1960 when he's 10. And he gets the same treatment as everybody else. Get in the pool, show me what you can do. But the legend that grew up and in researching it was always like, oh, Mark Spitz, he's the greatest kid swimmer ever. You know, he just jumped in the pool and did it. But no, he didn't. And Ferris and a couple other kids used to beat him routinely. So he had to work hard. He had to get going as well. Get a good lick each other. This is one of the stories that Chavoor in the book talks about. So these kids would swim and like the boys, you know, get rivalries and they'd always be looking over at each other. Where are they in the pool? Well, he said, you've got to stop doing that. That's going to cost you races. Finally, he pulled them out of the pool at Arden Hills. He made them stand there and look at each other. Look at each. You had enough of it now? Now get back in there and swim. So you laugh at it, you know, but it was a great technique, and Spitz never forgot it. You know, never forgot it. He used to talk about it all the time. That's the time when I learned that, you know, everybody remembers that picture? So he becomes the golden boy, and 1967. So Mexico City, he flops. He only has 2 gold medals, and those are in relays. He'd gone in being the top swimmer in the world, expected to win 7 or 8. The hype was enormous, and he admits it. You know, he just kind of didn't perform. Why? Well, he was Jewish, and he told a story in the book. He wrote a book, and in the book he said, well, so he, like I said, he had swum at, keep backing up here, he had swum at Arden Hills. Then he left Arden Hills when he was 14, and he went to Santa Clara. swam for a great coach there named George Haynes, and they had a great program too. But he never got along there. He didn't fit in. He didn't have the relationship with George Haynes, he and his father, and Mark's father was very domineering. They didn't have the relationships they had with Chavoor. So Spitz said, well, he felt that there was anti-Semitism at Santa Clara. Well, then he goes to the U.S. Olympic, he makes a U.S. Olympic team, and they go to a summer camp. They have a whole month, if you can imagine. Whose idea that was, I don't know. You don't lock up competitors, and that's what they were locked up, really, for a month going at each other without like a lot of bad feelings. But he wrote in his book that there were anti-Semitic taunts that the other swimmers made at him. He was the youngest member of the swim team and probably the best, at least in the trials period. And he felt that there was a lot of hostility. So he wrote that. And as evidence, he said that he was golfing with one of the girl swimmers, Susie Shields. And as they were out golfing, the other boys were taunting him for being Jewish. Well, I called Susie Shields, and this is reprinted many, many stories, all the way through 72. Mark Spitz, you know, who bombed in 68, had been the subject of Jewish taunts. And so I asked her, I called her, I found her, and I said, did that happen? Because it didn't sound to me, it just didn't ring true to me. And she said, no, that never happened. I hardly knew Mark Spitz, but that was the prime piece of evidence he used in that case. I don't know why. I think maybe psychologically he needed a reason to explain his failure in 68 and somehow resorted to that. And Chavoor, by the way, in his book, he also wrote a book, told the same story. But as far as I know, and according to the woman who was there, it just wasn't true. But he did become the Golden Boy. This is the famous picture after the 72 Olympics where he won his 7 gold medals. And it was the best-selling poster until Farrah Fawcett's poster came along. I know, because I had Farrah Fawcett's poster. München, 1972, the Happy Games. So again, as Mexico City had its issues, Munich had its issues. Munich, of course, was where the Nazi Party came to prominence in Germany. And the German authorities, of course, were very sensitive to this. The last time they had Olympics was in Berlin. And, you know, Hitler was stomping around and all the Nazi stuff. So they made every effort they could to downplay the role of the history, as you would. I mean, there wasn't anything diabolic about it. They just wanted a good image. By the way, that's a picture I took in Munich on vacation, so I just wanted to get that in there. But what a great town it was. And but as I said, they tried to tamp out all mention of the Nazi Olympics, and to the point of you couldn't even buy any books about Hitler in bookstores. They took them all out. Anything about Nazi Germany, they took them all out. And they also relaxed all the security. They didn't allow German police to carry guns with them. And they wanted the security at the Olympic Village was very, very relaxed. Some of the Americans even complained about it, saying, hey, this is, you know, you got to watch out. This should be stronger, but they never fixed it. So Spitz, of course, he won his 7 gold medals. This was a huge deal. Again, these were the most medals of any Olympian up to that point. And he did come through. And the story in it is, so Sherm Chavoor now is still coaching the women's Olympic team, still, and Burton and Spitz and other people. And the story tells really how Chavoor, everybody thinks, well, Spitz just jumped in the pool and won them. But it was almost every race was close. There were all kinds of psychological issues, you know. Spitz admits them, that he was somewhat, you know, emotionally fragile. And Chavoor helped him get through each and every one of these races. Mark Spitz didn't want to race in the 6th race. He'd won 5 gold. That surpassed Scholander's Olympic record. He didn't want to take a chance of losing it. And he said that all anybody will say is that I lost that 6th race. But Chavoor and Mike Burton got him in a room and said, you know, you got to do this, kid. You got to do it. And he did it. Mike Burton's comeback. By this time, Mike Burton's one of the older swimmers. He'd won the 2 golds in Mexico City, and he was considered past his prime, but he pulled a tremendous upset. We talked about the Nazi past. They wanted to get rid of that. And then, of course, that led, or didn't lead to, but they were victimized by the Munich massacre. And the famous sportscaster, Jim Simpson, said, just a famous quote, they came in, and of course, Spitz is Jewish, right? And they're very concerned, Chavoor is, and Chavoor finds a way to get the press off of his, where is Spitz? Well, he's not going to tell him. And he kind of hides him away and gets him out of the country right away. And the story of the news conference they have the next day after Spitz won his gold medals, and then this is happening in real time. I mean, it's just incredible what Mark Spitz had to go through. And I don't think he gets acknowledged for the performance that he put in to deal with all this stuff. But when it was all over and the athletes were massacred and the big shootout at the airport, Jim Simpson said, my father always told me that our greatest hopes and our worst fears are seldom realized. Tonight, our worst fears are realized. Horrible, horrible thing. Of course, Spitz is honored in Sacramento. He comes back home and big hero. And there he is with Ronald Reagan. And I just love the look on Patty Reagan's face here. Like, huh. But he stays in Sacramento a couple of months, and then he leaves for LA, and he's signs contracts worth millions of dollars. And everybody thought he was going to be a big television star, but that never panned out for him. But he has had a successful life. He didn't do an interview for the book, which disappointed me. And he's kind of, I wouldn't say secretive, but he's a little bit not as outgoing as other people. And but he's been married for many, many years and never in any scandals or anything. So I think he's had an admirable life. Everybody's son. So that's Mike Burton, the great swimmer. So as I said, he had a big comeback in '72. He wasn't even expected to make the Olympic team. He got the last slot on the team for swimming. So he goes to Munich, and there's younger swimmers. They're favored to beat him. And somehow he pulls off this huge upset. And in the Sacramento Bee, there was a letter to the editor, and it said, I cheered for Mark Spitz, for his achievement, but I was crying when Mike Burton won. So there was an interlude then, so 68 or 72 rather, and then they don't make the Olympics, any Olympians in 76, and then there's the boycott in 80. So we have a interlude there, even though there were still many, many great swimmers. It's really, even at the highest level, you're talking about hundreds of seconds of making the Olympic team or not. So there are many great swimmers from Arden Hills that didn't make the Olympic team, but were still fantastic. The colleges up and down the country were lined with swimmers from Arden Hills for many, many years. But the local media, as the local media or any media will do, they jumped on it. Chavoor had lost it, they said. He doesn't have the mojo anymore. His tactics are too brutal. He doesn't understand the modern swimmer, blah, blah, blah. But there was one kid left. And that's Jeff Float. Went to the '84 Olympics. And, he, in '80, probably suffered as much or more as any athlete because of the cancellation of those games. And he probably would have won at least 2 or 3 gold medals there, at least. And they just took it away from him. And, Walter Mondale, vice president, said it was the biggest mistake that they'd ever made was to cancel those games. But Jeff had to get through that. Because of the Russian and the Soviet invasion. Okay, we'll get questions at the end. Anyway, he comes through, and Jeff is deaf. And during the Olympic medal presentation, he signed to the crowd with the TV cameras on him, "I love you." So that's the kind of guy he is. How did he do it? This is Chavoor's 2 daughters. They live in Carmichael. One does, one in Davis. And they didn't even know a lot of these things that I found out. They told me, actually, when I was doing the book, I walked in, I was about halfway through the research, and they said, his real name wasn't Sherm Chavoor. No, I didn't know that. So, but how did he do it? And I think he thought of himself as a teacher above all. That's what he had started out as, teacher and the coach of the Olympics, coach at the Y. And his whole life, he wanted to influence kids. And, you know, a lot of people didn't get along with him. He was very rough. If you didn't kind of buy into his program, he didn't have much use for you, and made no bones about it. He wouldn't put up with parents. So that kind of guy, and drove them extremely hard. But I can't put my finger on exactly what it was. I mean, I think some of it was fortunate. And he said himself, you know, you have to have the talent in the pool, but how all that talent showed up and turned out like that, I don't know. The great Indiana swim coach, Doc Councilman, came and visited one summer. I think he was secretly trying to recruit Mark Spitz for Indiana, which is where Mark Spitz ended up in his college career. But he said, you know, nobody does this. Nobody does homegrown Olympians like this. If they have a club, they are bringing kids in from all over the country to do it, but nobody homegrows them like this. But he was quickly forgotten when he passed away at age 73. The New York Times obituary was Sherm Chavoor, 73, a swimming coach. And it was about a 3-paragraph story. That was it. There was no park named after him, no pool. As far as I know, there's no monument or any recognition of anything here in Sacramento for Sherm Chavoor, other than what they had in Arden Hills, which was just a one hallway. But his swimmers do remember him. So there's me, Jeff Float, and Debbie earlier this year at a book signing. And you know what? They all love him. They all love Sherm Chavoor. And that's the greatest testament you can have. You can have a million critics write stuff about you, but they don't know you. Where are the gold medals? Well, around my neck right there. And I'm sorry they're not here tonight. Debbie couldn't make it, and I don't know where Jeff was. But they will be here in Sacramento Wednesday at the Sacramento Center for History. We're doing another program. So if you want to see them or get an autographs, they'll be there. Okay. I'm right on time. I'm right on time, right? 15 minutes for questions.
Perfect job. Well, thank you so much, Bill. This was very enlightening. Wonderful, wonderful job. We will now take your questions from the live audience, and also for those of you watching on Zoom, you can put them in the Q&A. I'm sorry that Mark Spitz didn't come through with an interview with you, but 3 years ago, our forum group had on Zoom during COVID, Beth Ruyak interviewed all of them. And in the beginning, Mark Spitz refused to be interviewed. He didn't want to be part of it. But when he found out everyone else was doing it, he called us back and said, yes, I'll do it.
Yeah,
So
I know.
don't give up.
I know. Well, the book's written.
Yeah.
So I
actually-
saw that. I watched that interview. And, you know, I mean, frankly, being a historian and a reporter, especially a historian, there's not a lot to ask people that you don't know. There's a few things that come out. So I don't think it really hurt the book, but I would have liked to ask. I'd like to ask him about that. You said with Susie Shields that, you know, what's the truth on that? So.
Did Mike Burton ever coach swimming?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Mike coached for a lot of years.
Did he ever coach at a place called Sutter Lawn?
I don't know. I don't think so. He kind of left Sacramento and he coached in Des Moines, Iowa. He coached in Portland. I don't know that he ever coached at Sutter Lawn though.
Thank you.
How did he end up getting the backing to build Arden Hills?
That's a great question. And of course, after I write the book, all these people come up and tell me, you know what, which I meant. So the story he tells, so he wrote a book. He said he walked door to door and that he mortgaged everything that he had, sold off things, and begged, borrowed, and stole the money. The other story I heard after that was that there was a group of people that did put up some money to him. I don't know if they'd loaned it to him or gave him a grant or what, but those are the two stories. But his daughter said he put in a lot of his, I'm sure he put in a lot of his own money, and he worked at it relentlessly. You know, again, people, swim coaches don't, most coaches of amateur sports anyway, don't become rich and famous. It's rich, and he did, and he, you know, he worked really hard at it. He marketed the club relentlessly, and he and his wife would, you know, be there late at night sending out payment notices and all the paperwork you have to do. He didn't smoke or drink, so you know, he pretty much put his whole life into Arden Hills.
Did his two daughters swim?
No. No, they didn't. And he even in his book, which by the way, his book, although it was ghostwritten, was a very successful book. And a lot of swimming people obviously read it. And at the time it came out. But in his book, he said that he wouldn't impose the torture on his own daughters that he imposed on the other swimmers.
Yeah.
So they played tennis. Sharon was a very good tennis player, actually played with Rosie Casals, and I think beat Rosie Casals, who was, people remember Rosie Casals, but to remember, I'm old. These names don't mean anything. So she was a very good tennis player, and his other daughter was a equestrian.
Yes, my folks joined Arden Hills almost from the beginning, and I swam for Sherm for maybe 2 weeks. Yeah.
You lasted a lot longer than a lot of people.
I know. And I said, this isn't any fun at all. And it's not how I'm going to spend my summers, and I quit. So, yeah, so he was tough. Yeah. But I wasn't that good anyway.
Well, I'm glad you're here. Thank you.
Do we have any questions from the chat?
Thank you. That was very interesting. I swam in high school during that period of time, and I had a number of friends of mine who went to Arden Hills. One of the things that characterized that time were these swimming clubs had a lot of racial restrictions. I had a close friend of mine who swam at Park Terrace. He's Chinese American. They would not allow him to be a full member of the club, but he could be an athletic member and serve their swimming team, but his family couldn't be a member. So, but what I found in your history there that was quite interesting, and Chavoor was under there were some public attacks. I know one of the last things I read in the Bee about him had some racial problems with it, to say the least. What's the real story there?
Well, I think the real story is that he made a point of saying in public, first of all, he hated the Olympic officials, hated them. And he said a bunch of snobby, he didn't call them racist, but might as well, white, upper class, you know, noble women. He didn't like the elitism in sport. His best friend was Stan Johnson, one of his best friends. Stan Johnson was a track coach here at Sac State, and quite a prominent one, ended up being a U.S. Olympic team coach. And then he writes, and look at his record with the kids at the Y. If he had been a racist, there's no way that he would have done what he did there. When Mark Spitz came, and this is according to Spitz, Sherm's got his version of everything, so I have to check his version out against other versions. But Spitz said in his book that when his father approached Chavoor so Spitz was swimming at the Y, and then his father wanted to develop because the kids from Arden Hills were waxing him. So he took him to Chavoor, and he said, look, we're Jewish. Is that going to matter? Is my son going to have a chance? And he said, because I think the racial things you're talking about pertain to Jews as well. A lot of Jews people forget this, couldn't belong to country clubs. And in Spitz's book, his father said, yes, of course, he's going to have the equal shot with everybody. And he said that he names it something like 42 Asian members or something at that point. I know an Asian kid that was at Arden Hills at the time. There was one incident where, and as far as I know, only one. And you talk about Land Park. Well, Terrace, he said in his book, Chavoor said that he left there because of racism, because they wouldn't allow him to let minorities in. So he said that. This is all in the record. And where was I? There was one incident, and there was a guy who was actually a Filipino, and he was at an event at Arden Hills, and he, according to the record, he got into altercation with Chavoor, and Chavoor called him a racial epithet for Japanese Americans. The guy took him to court and won a judgment against Chavoor. But all Chavoor, Chavoor said it was the heat of the moment. I was mad. I don't think that way. So that was the one only stain I could see against it until, I think you're talking about a comment that was made in the Bee. Yeah, and I saw that, and I tried to track that down. I've had other people approach me and say, well, he was a racist. I said, well, you want to go on the record? What's your example? Who can you introduce me to that will tell me that story? So it never went anywhere. So if it's there, it just doesn't ring true to me. I mean, he was rough. I mean, I had coaches when I played football, they called you. I grew up in Chicago. Okay. You were either, I can't say these names, but you were either this or that or that, right? Depending on your European descendants, and the no bones about it. So I just think it was the era, and it was the way he talked.
We've got a couple of questions from the Q&A in the Zoom. The first one was, did Debbie Meyer ever coach?
Yes, Debbie had a swim school here in Sacramento. I think half of Sacramento went to it. And whenever she goes to events, all of these women of a certain age come out and say, Debbie, oh, so great you coach me. And they all have their daughters with them.
There's another question. Didn't Mark Spitz compete in the later Olympics when he was in his 40s?
He tried to. He had a comeback. I think it was really more of a PR stunt than anything else. But he did not make the Olympic team. Didn't even go to the Olympic trials. But he did have a comeback. I think he was in his 40s. He still had very good times. He just didn't have world-class times.
Yeah. There's another question. It's kind of there's several parts. Let's see. It says, how expensive was Arden Hills membership back then? And then how did these families afford to join? Did the kids get scholarships?
I don't know. I can't answer in relative terms. I don't think it was all that expensive.
Oh, there's.
Hold on.
Yep.
Let's get the mic. Get the mic.
You have to have the internet crowd can hear you.
We joined in 1981, and it was $50 to join.
$50 in 81,
50,
which is $2 million today. No,
and it was $50 a month.
50 a month. Yeah, I think earlier it was $10 a month in the 50s, as I remember. So I don't know relative though how that was, but and I should say, so if there was a kid, and there are several stories about Chavoor. So Mike Burton, his family was not well off, and Mike Burton will tell you that Chavoor would do anything for him to get, make. Of course, Mike Burton was a 3-time Olympic swimmer, gold medal swimmer too. But he said he would find jobs for people around to keep them swimming. So hope that helps.
Okay. Any more questions? Well, let's give Bill another huge hand.
I just want to say one more thing. So this is Life magazine. Again, the Olympics were late that year, but Debbie was supposed to be on the cover of this. She got knocked off by Jackie Onassis, but there's a whole photo spread in here if you want to see it come up. Oh, that was 1968, November 1st, I think.